The snow came sideways that night, not in flakes but in sheets, as if the sky itself had torn open and was bleeding white. A man was crawling through it, not walking, not stumbling, crawling on his hands and knees, his massive frame reduced to something animal and desperate, pushing through drifts that rose to his chest in places and swallowed his arms to the elbow with every forward reach. His name was Abel Cray, and he was a man who had spent 30 years bending iron to his will, a man whose hands had shaped horseshoes and plow blades and wagon axles, a man who had never in his life asked anything of anyone. He was asking now. He was asking the earth to let him live just a little longer. He could not see more than 3 feet in front of his face. The wind was not a sound so much as a pressure, a constant vicious force that pushed against him like a living thing trying to hold him back. The cold had moved past pain into something else, something quieter and more dangerous. A numbness that started at his fingers and was working its way up his arms with patient, terrible efficiency. He had stopped feeling his feet somewhere back in the dark, somewhere between the collapsed wall of his house and the forge. He had not been able to reach his body, making its quiet decisions about what it could afford to feel and what it could not. But he kept moving. He kept moving because somewhere in the white, nothing ahead of him, he believed there was a hole in the ground. A dark square cut into the earth, framed in granite, sealed with iron. And from that hole, if he remembered correctly, if the woman who had stood in his forge and looked him in the eye had not been lying or dreaming or out of her mind, with grief there rose a warmth that had nothing to do with fire. He fell again. His face hit the snow and he lay there for a moment, breathing hard, the air so cold it burned his throat on the way in. He thought about staying down, just for a moment, just to rest. The snow was not uncomfortable in the way he had expected. It was soft. It had a quality of acceptance that the world above ground often did not, a willingness to receive whatever came to it without resistance or judgment. He understood in the dim and slowing way of a mind that is running out of fuel that this was the most dangerous thought he had ever had. He thought about a pair of eyes, gray eyes, steady and serious, looking at him across a worn wooden counter, a voice that did not waver, even though everything behind it was shaking. I will pay you. Not a plea. A statement. A fact about the future spoken from the present, with a certainty he had not believed at the time, but had not been able to forget since. He pushed himself back up. He kept moving toward the warmth he could not yet feel, guided by nothing more reliable than the memory of a woman's face and a direction his body had committed to before his mind had finished arguing about it. 6 weeks earlier, the sky above Greystone Pass, Wyoming, had been the color of an old pewter pot, heavy and seamless from one edge of the horizon to the other. It was the kind of sky that did not promise winter so much as announce it, the way a judge announces a sentence without apology and without room for appeal. The aspens had already surrendered their gold. The pines stood dark and patient against the hillsides, as they always did, as they always would, indifferent to what the sky was saying, because they had heard it before and had made their accommodations long ago. The town of Greystone Pass sat in the valley below them, a modest collection of weathered buildings arranged along a single main street, as if huddling together for warmth, which in a few weeks they would need to do in earnest. Elara Holt stood on a rise above a piece of land that no one in the county wanted, and she tried to find something in it worth holding on to. There was not much to find. 5 acres of stony, reluctant earth stretched out below her, the grass growing in thin, defeated patches between outcroppings of granite that pushed up through the soil like bones through skin. The granite was everywhere. Here, the underlying skeleton of the land refusing to stay decently buried, asserting itself through every attempt the thin topsoil made at covering it. A stand of stubborn pines clung to the eastern edge of the property, their trunks twisted by decades of wind into shapes that looked less like trees and more like old men arguing with each other, their postures fixed in permanent disagreement with whatever direction the wind was currently coming from. In the rough center of the land, the remains of a small cabin sagged against the earth, its roof long since collapsed inward, its walls leaning toward each other like survivors of something the chimney, the only part of it still standing with any conviction, rising from the wreckage with a kind of stubborn dignity that the rest of the structure had abandoned. The locals called this place the Scratch. They had called it that for as long as anyone could remember, and the name was not affectionate. It was descriptive in the way that the most accurate names usually are. It was the kind of place that made you scratch your head and wonder what a man had been thinking when he decided to lay claim to it. But Elara was not looking at the cabin, or the twisted pines, or the stubborn grass. She was looking at something else. About 50 paces from the collapsed structure, set into the ground like a secret that had been buried, and then thought better of, was a door. It was not a normal door in any sense that the word normally applied. It was massive and deliberately overbuilt, a slab of iron set into a frame of quarried granite that had been fitted into the earth with a precision that seemed out of place on a property this rough. The kind of precision that required intention and skill, and a great deal of time, none of which this land seemed to have invited. The iron was thick, thicker than her hand was wide, and it was dark with decades of rust that had not weakened it so much as armored it further, the way some things grow harder with age rather than softer. A chain was looped through a heavy iron ring set into the face of the door, and the chain was enormous, each link as wide as her wrist, forged from iron, that even now, after years of Wyoming weather, held a density and solidity that spoke of serious intent. The chain was fastened with a padlock that had long since fused shut the shackle and body corroded into a single solid mass that no key would ever turn again. The lock having become over the years not a mechanism, but a monument. The whole apparatus had the look of something built not to keep people out, so much as to keep something safe, which was not quite the same thing and carried a different set of implications. Her father had built it. Elara was 22 years old, and she was a widow, and she was cold, and she was standing on land that the entire town of Greystone Pass had agreed was worthless, and the only person in the world who might have explained any of this to her had been dead for 3 months. The title of widow still felt strange on her, not because she was unacquainted with grief, but because the word suggested a kind of completion that did not match what she actually felt, which was less like the end of something and more like a sentence interrupted mid-clause. The thought unfinished, the meaning suspended in a silence that did not resolve. Walter Holt had been a geologist by training and a dreamer by nature, which in a cattle and timber economy like the one that sustained Greystone Pass was more or less the same as being a fool by profession. He had come to Wyoming from the East 20 years before with a trunk full of scientific instruments and a mind full of questions that the landscape refused to answer quickly. He had brought with him the habits of a man educated in the formal sciences, the compulsion to measure and record and cross-reference to understand the world by accumulating data about it, rather than by asking the people who had been living in it for generations. This had not endeared him to those people. He had spent his life reading the earth the way other men read ledgers in the strata of canyon walls and the patterns of hot springs and the temperature of groundwater in deep-dug wells, finding in these things a narrative that satisfied him in ways that the social narratives of Greystone Pass did not. He had theories that his neighbors did not understand and observations that they did not care about. He had been, in the gentle estimation of the town, an eccentric. In the less gentle estimation of the men who gathered at the saloon on Friday evenings, he had been something closer to a crank, a characterization that is applied to people who are wrong, and also occasionally and unfortunately to people who are right too early. For the last 10 years of his life, he had lived alone on the scratch, not farming it because the soil would not support it, not ranching on it because the grass was too sparse and the terrain too rough. He had been digging, methodically, patiently, with the particular stubbornness of a man who is certain he is right and content to wait for the world to catch up with him. He had dug alone, hiring help only occasionally and briefly temporary labor from passing hands who did not stay long enough to understand what they were helping to build, and did not ask questions because their wages did not include answers. He had spoken to no one in town about what he was building or why. He had simply disappeared into that rocky patch of land every morning and come back to town for supplies every few weeks, quieter each time, more inward and more certain of something that he never shared with anyone who might have laughed at him. The certainty itself was visible to people who looked closely, a quality in his eyes that was not madness as many assumed, but its near neighbor, absolute conviction about something the evidence had not yet caught up with. He had died in July of a fever or so, the death certificate said. The fever had come on quickly, as fevers sometimes do in men who have been working too hard in the summer heat. And by the time Doc Harrow had been summoned, there had been little enough to be done. Walter Holt had been buried in the Greystone Pass Cemetery on a Thursday afternoon with a modest ceremony attended by fewer people than a man deserved. After 20 years in the same community, regardless of how eccentrically those years had been spent. By Friday, the gossip had already moved on to other things, because a strange old man dying alone on a piece of worthless land was not, in the scheme of things, a remarkable event. He had left everything to his daughter. Elara's husband, Emmett, had been a timberman, skilled and careful in the woods, but helpless against a river running 20 feet above its banks in the grip of a March flood. His boat had gone over in seconds, they told her. He would not have suffered, as if the speed of a loss had anything to do with the depth of it, as if the measure of grief was the duration of the dying, rather than the magnitude of what was gone. She had been left with the memory of a good man, the specific and irreplaceable memory of him, the way he moved through the rooms of their small house, the sound of his voice when he was tired, the smell of pine resin that never quite left his clothing, all of it still entirely present in her mind, while the person who had generated it was gone. She had been left with a handful of dollars that would not carry her through a Wyoming winter. And now this a deed to 5 acres of stone and wind, and a door in the ground that her dead father had built with 10 years of lonely labor, and sealed against the world with iron and granite, and a rusted padlock that no longer had a key that could open it. The lawyer, a thin man named Aldous Finch, who wore his suits 2 sizes too large and kept his office in a permanent state of organized chaos, had handed her the key 3 days after Walter's funeral. It was a single ornate piece of brass, old and carefully kept. The kind of key that looked like it belonged to something important. Its shaft engraved with a pattern of fine lines that served no functional purpose, but spoke of a craftsman who had made it with more attention than the job strictly required. He had also handed her an envelope sealed with wax, with her name written on the outside in her father's precise angular script. The letters formed with the same exactness he applied to everything, each one distinct and deliberate. She had opened it there in the lawyer's office, standing at his cluttered desk while Finch pretended to organize papers, and actually watched her from the corner of his eye. The letter was brief. Walter Holt had never been a man to use 10 words where 5 would do a quality that, in conversation, had often read as abruptness, but in writing revealed itself as a kind of precision, every word placed because it was needed, and not one more. My dearest Elara, forgive the mess. The value is not on the surface. The surface is a liar. 40 steps down the earth keeps its promises. Do not sell. Do not listen to them. Trust the deep warmth. Your loving father. He had underlined the word warmth 3 times. 3 deliberate strokes of his pen pressed into the paper with a firmness that had nearly torn it, as if he was afraid she might read past it, or as if the word itself was not sufficient, and the emphasis had to do the work that the word could not fully accomplish alone. She read it twice, then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and looked up and found that Aldous Finch was no longer pretending to organize papers. He was looking at her directly, and his expression was something she could not quite name. Not pity exactly. Something more complicated than pity. The expression of a man who is aware of something he would rather not be aware of, and who has made a private accommodation with his own discomfort that he hopes will not be required to hold up under scrutiny. She held that expression in mind the way her father had taught her to hold things not pressing on them, before they were ready to yield, but not setting them aside either. She walked out of the office into the gray October morning, and nearly walked into a man who was standing just outside the door. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the particular gravity of someone who has never had to raise his voice to be heard. The authority that comes not from physical presence, but from the long habit of having one's expectations met. His coat was good wool, his boots were polished, and his face was arranged in an expression of warmth that reached everywhere, except his eyes, which were pale and sharp and constantly calculating in the way of a man who has learned early that information is more valuable than land, and that the two are often the same thing. His name was Garrison Pruitt, and he was the chairman of the Greystone Pass Town Council, which made him, in the practical arithmetic of a small Wyoming town, as close to a figure of authority as the place produced. He had held the position for 12 years and had held the room in every meeting of that period, and the community had come to understand his opinions as the reasonable center of things. which is a dangerous position for anyone to occupy too long. He expressed his condolences about Walter. He expressed them smoothly and at the right length, not so brief as to seem callous, and not so extended as to invite conversation he could not control. He had the social skills of a man who has spent decades managing the impressions he makes on people. And those skills were on full display in the precise calibration of his sympathy, which felt genuine right up until the moment you tried to find the feeling behind it, and found instead a performance of feeling executed flawlessly but empty at the center. Then he mentioned, as if the thought had just occurred to him in the natural flow of conversation, that he had been thinking about the situation Elara now found herself in, and that he hoped she knew she had friends in this community who were concerned for her well-being. He paused to let that settle. Then he said that the town council had been discussing for some time the need to expand the Greystone Pass Cemetery. The current grounds were nearing capacity, which was a practical problem that would need to be addressed sooner rather than later. And it had occurred to him in thinking through the available options that the parcel of land her father had left her, being so rough and remote and unsuited to any agricultural purpose, might serve the town's need admirably. It would not be a sale so much as a public service, a way for her to turn what was, by all honest assessment, a liability into something that benefited the entire community. He made it sound like a favor she would be doing for everyone, including herself. He offered her $20. Elara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the letter in her pocket, its precise angular handwriting, the word warmth pressed into the paper 3 times. She thought about the kind of man who had written it, the kind of man who had spent 10 years on a piece of land that everyone agreed was worthless, without ever explaining to anyone why and who had chosen to explain it. Only to her. Only now in a letter she was holding in her pocket while the chairman of the town council stood in front of her, offering $20. She thought about the timing of it, the fact that this man was standing outside this door at this precise moment. She said, "No thank you, Mr. Pruitt." Something moved behind his eyes, not anger exactly. Something colder and more controlled than anger. The slight recalibration of a man who has encountered unexpected resistance from a quarter he had considered. Settled the internal adjustment of someone whose plan has encountered a variable it had not accounted for. He recovered immediately, of course. His expression did not change in any way that was visible. He said he understood completely, and that his offer would remain open should she change her mind, and that she should not hesitate to call on the council if she needed anything at all. He said all of this with the same practiced warmth he had opened with, and then he tipped his hat and walked away down the street with the unhurried step of a man who has other plans and is already thinking about them. Elara watched him go. Then she looked back through the window of Aldous Finch's office. Finch was standing at his desk. He had not moved to see any other clients. He was watching Pruitt walk away down the street, and his expression when he turned back to his desk and found Elara's eyes on him through the glass was the expression of a man who has just been caught at something he would prefer not to name. He turned away quickly and busied himself with papers. She filed that away, the way her father had taught her to file things carefully and without forcing the interpretation. Not necessarily useful right now, but worth keeping. She walked to the scratch. The road out of Greystone Pass was not much of a road at this time of year. The packed earth softened by the first of the autumn rains and beginning to develop the ruts that would deepen through winter. She walked it in under an hour, carrying the brass key in her coat pocket alongside her father's letter, feeling the weight of both of them, the key solid and certain, and the letter something else, something that wanted her attention in a way that metal did not. The wind came down from the high country in long, patient sweeps, testing the temperature of things, making its assessments about what kind of winter this was gonna be. The brass key did not fit the padlock on the iron door. She had expected this somehow with the part of her mind that had been paying attention to the kind of man her father was. He had not been a man who did obvious things. She crouched in front of the great rusted lock and tried the key from 3 different angles gently, and then with some force, and the key slid and turned and accomplished nothing. The lock was a solid mass of corrosion, a decade of Wyoming weather having welded shackle to body in a bond that no key would break. She would need something else for the door. But first, she needed to understand the door. She needed to understand everything about it before she decided what to do. She stood up and turned to look at the collapsed cabin. The cabin had once been a small but functional structure, one main room with a loft and a stone chimney that had outlasted everything else. Walter had lived in it for years before he had apparently stopped sleeping in it, in favor of whatever he had built beneath the ground. She picked her way through the fallen timbers, carefully testing each one before she put her weight on it, stepping over the places where the floor had rotted through. There was not much left of value. Some tools weathered and stiff, a tin cup, a small cast iron skillet, black with years of accumulated use. But in the far corner of the main room beneath what had been a low shelf, before the shelf had given up and fallen, her boot knocked against something solid that did not have the hollow sound of rotted wood or the flat sound of stone. She crouched down and cleared away fallen plaster and a rusted tin basin and found a box. It was not large, the size of a small bread box made of iron with a hinged lid and 2 iron straps riveted along its sides with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of someone who did not want the thing to fail. It had been pushed back against the wall and partially buried under the debris, and it had been there long enough that the dirt had packed itself around its edges. She worked it free and carried it out into the gray daylight. The brass key fit the lock on the iron chest perfectly. The lid opened with a resistance that told her it had not been opened in some time, the hinges stiff and protesting. Inside, folded carefully, was the deed to the property. Beside it was a second envelope sealed with the same dark wax as the first, with her name on it, in the same precise hand. And beneath both of these, wrapped in oilskin and tied with a leather cord, was a journal. The last one, the final volume of whatever Walter Holt had been recording for the last decade of his solitary work. She opened the second envelope first. This letter was longer than the first. Walter had allowed himself more room here away from the lawyer's office and the possibility of prying eyes. He wrote that he was sorry for the condition of the cabin and that he knew it would confuse her. He wrote that what he had built on this land was the most important thing he had ever done, and that he had not spoken of it publicly because men with power and money have a way of taking things from those who lack both, and he had not been willing to risk what he had found until it was properly secured. He wrote that the key to the padlock on the door was not a key at all, that the great rusted lock was a decoy, and that the door itself opened by a different mechanism, which he explained in 3 precise sentences. He wrote that she should trust what she found below, and that he had built it for her, and that he was sorry he had not been able to explain it to her in person, but that he had expected to have more time. Then he wrote, "Someone has been watching this land. I have found signs twice now of men who came here in the night and looked at the door and went away. I believe I know who sent them, and I believe I know why. And I have taken steps to protect what I have found in ways that will outlast me, if I am not mistaken about the law. Be careful, Elara. The scratch is not what it appears to be. Neither are some of the men in Greystone Pass. If something happens to me before I can tell you this in person, know that it was not the fever. Your father never had a fever in his life." She read that last sentence 3 times. Then she set the letter down on the cold granite beside her and sat very still for a moment, listening to the wind move across the empty land. She picked up the journal. She did not read all of it. It was dense and technical, filled with temperature readings and geological notations and hand-drawn cross-sections of what appeared to be underground chambers, the measurements precise, and the annotations written in her father's small, controlled script. She understood pieces of it. He had taught her more geology than most daughters of the time were taught, sitting at the kitchen table when she was small, explaining the earth the way other fathers explained arithmetic. She understood the vocabulary, if not always the calculations. She turned to the last entry. It was dated 4 days before his death. He wrote that he had returned to the cabin from 3 days in Cheyenne, where he had visited the Territorial Land Office to complete the final registration of his claims under Wyoming territorial law. The federal patent had been granted the previous December, he wrote, but the Territorial Registry required a separate and supplementary filing, a procedural distinction that mattered for the full protection of his rights under both federal and territorial jurisdiction. He had needed to do this in person, and he had needed to do it without drawing attention to the reason, and he had accomplished both. He was satisfied that the legal protections were now complete at every applicable level of authority. He wrote that he had found the camp disturbed again on his return. More seriously this time, with clear evidence that someone had not only surveyed the ground around the iron door, but had attempted to force it and failed. He identified 2 sets of boot prints in the soft ground near the granite frame. One set was familiar. He wrote that he was not frightened so much as careful, and that he had made arrangements for the documentation to reach his daughter, regardless of what happened to him, and that he believed the law would protect what he had found, because he had been very careful about the law. Then he wrote in the last line of the last page, "I wish I had told her more. I hope what I built is enough." Elara sat on the cold granite beside the iron chest for a long time. The wind moved over the scratch with its usual indifference, tugging at her coat and pulling strands of dark hair across her face. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the weeks after Emmett's death in the small house they had shared, lying in the dark, listening to the river that had taken him, and trying to understand how the world could continue to make its ordinary sounds when everything that mattered had gone quiet. She had emptied herself of tears somewhere in those weeks, and what was left was something harder and less comfortable but more useful. She had discovered someone who fell apart. She was someone who waited to understand what she was dealing with before she decided what to do about it. She understood now that her father had built something here. She understood that someone in Greystone Pass had known about it, or suspected it, and had tried to take it from him. She understood that he was dead, and that the letter he had written to her had contained tucked inside its final sentence a message about his death that she was going to have to sit with for some time before she could decide what it meant. She understood that the brass key fit a lock on an iron chest, not a lock on an iron door. And she understood that the great rusted padlock and chain on the door were, according to her father's letter, a misdirection. The door opened by a different mechanism. She read his instructions again. 3 sentences. She stood up and walked to the door and crouched beside it and ran her hands along the granite frame on the left side, pressing where he had said to press. Nothing moved. She pressed again harder, and this time she felt something give, not much, just a slight compression in what she had taken for solid granite. A cleverly fitted stone that concealed a small lever mechanism beneath it. She heard a sound deep and quiet, like something releasing. But the door itself did not move. She pressed harder against the iron face of the door, and it swayed just slightly, just enough to tell her that whatever had been holding it had released. But the weight of it and decades of rust in the hinge joints were still holding it in place. She would need tools, real tools, more than she had. She stood up and looked at the door for a long moment. Then she looked at the chain and the massive fused padlock still hanging through the iron ring. Anyone who came to this door would see the chain and the lock and assume the door was still sealed. The lock was a decoy, but it was a decoy that was still doing its job. She decided to leave it exactly where it was. She picked up the iron chest and carried it back toward town. The town of Greystone Pass was not a cruel place. It was a practical place, which is sometimes worse. Its people had been shaped by the particular demands of high-altitude Wyoming living, where winters were long and unforgiving, and a man or woman's value was assessed primarily by their ability to produce something useful from a hostile landscape. Cinnamon was not unwelcome, but it ranked below usefulness in the community's accounting of what mattered. The widow of a drowned timberman who had inherited a patch of useless rock from a peculiar father was not in the arithmetic of Greystone Pass an asset. She was a problem that the community hoped would solve itself by leaving. The women she passed on the main street were kind enough. They asked how she was holding up. They expressed concern. They suggested gently that she might consider writing to a cousin or an aunt in a place with better prospects, somewhere warmer, perhaps Denver or Cheyenne somewhere. A young woman with no husband and no income and no useful land might find a way to begin again. Their concern was genuine. It was also a polite way of asking when she was planning to leave. She walked past the general store and the feed supply and the small whitewashed building that served as both the town council's meeting hall and on Sundays the community church. And she turned at the end of the main street and walked to the edge of town where Abel Cray kept his forge. She noticed as she passed the meeting hall that there was a light in the window. Despite the hour and through the glass, she saw the shape of a man sitting at the council table alone, his head bent over papers. She did not slow her pace, but she took note of it. The forge was the largest structure in Greystone Pass, and also in some essential way the most honest. It made no pretense of being anything other than what it was, a working place built for function, rather than appearance. Stone walls black with years of soot. The great chimney pouring its thin smoke into the gray sky. The double doors standing open even in October, because the furnace inside made the immediate air warm enough to work in without a coat. Abel Cray worked in shirt sleeves from April to December, and he was not cold. He was a compact, broad man with forearms that seemed slightly too large for the rest of him, the result of 30 years of hammer work. And he had the particular stillness of a man who had learned very early that physical power is most effective when it is not wasted. He had known Walter Holt, not well the way no one had known Walter well, but in the particular way of a craftsman who had encountered another craftsman's work and recognized quality. Walter had commissioned ironwork from him over the years, specialized pieces, unusual fittings and brackets and grating that Abel had made to exacting specifications without being told what they were for. The grating he had made 3 years ago, 6 feet across, with a particular mesh that allowed air movement while supporting significant weight. The brackets fitted for a stovepipe rising through a narrow vertical space. The hinges massive and overbuilt, designed for a door far heavier than any door in Greystone Pass required. He had not asked what they were for, because Walter had not invited questions. And Abel Cray was not a man who pressed where he was not welcome. But he had wondered. He watched Alara approach his forge from across the yard with the expression of a man who is taking inventory. She set the iron chest down on the low wall outside his door and told him what she needed, not what she was doing, not why. Just the tools, a heavy sledgehammer, a long pry bar, a set of hardened steel wedges, and a coil of good rope. She listed them precisely the way her father had always listed things he needed without preamble or apology. Abel looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the tools she was describing running through his inventory in his head. He had all of them. He asked no questions. He gathered the items from his workshop with the economical movements of a man who knows exactly where everything is, and he set them on the wall beside the iron chest. She placed her money on the wall beside them. It was not enough. They both knew it without saying so. She had counted it twice before she came, hoping she had miscounted, and she had not. Abel pushed the money back toward her with one finger. He said the word credit in the flat, definitive tone of a man who has made a decision and does not plan to revisit it. He said it in a way that was meant to sound businesslike, and it was businesslike, but it was also kind, and the kindness was the part he was trying to disguise, because he was a man who was more comfortable with iron than with sympathy, and he did not entirely know what to do with the feeling that was prompting him to help a young widow who was clearly on a fool's errand. He looked at her hands when he pushed the money back. They were not the hands of a woman who had done heavy physical work. They were soft and uncalloused smooth, in a way that would not survive what she was planning to do with them. He thought about saying something. He looked at her face instead. Her face was composed. Not blank, which would have been easier to dismiss, but composed in the way of someone who has already had the conversation with themselves where they weighed the risks and the alternatives and the likelihood of success and decided to proceed anyway. It was the face of someone who had been through something hard and come out the other side of it still standing, not unchanged, but not broken either. He had seen that face before. He had seen it on men coming home from wars, and on women who had buried children, and on a handful of people in his life who had simply quietly refused to be defeated by what had defeated other people. He did not say what he had been going to say about the softness of her hands. She loaded the tools onto a handcart he offered, and she said she would pay him. Not, "Thank you," he noticed. Not, "I'll try." She said, "I will pay you," with the same flat definitiveness he had used with the word credit, as if she were stating a fact about the future that she intended to make true, by force of will, if necessary. He just nodded and turned back to his fire. She pushed the handcart 2 miles out of town to the scratch, and by the time she arrived, the light was already beginning to go, the sky darkening in the east, while the west held a thin strip of cold orange. She did not stop to rest. She unloaded the tools and she stood before the iron door in the last of the failing light. And she told herself, because she needed to say it out loud to someone, even if that someone was only herself, that her father had built something real. That a man who had underlined the word warmth 3 times was not a man who wrote things he did not mean. That below this door was something worth finding. Then she picked up the sledgehammer. The first blow rang off the chain like a bell. The sound carried across the empty land and came back to her from the distant tree line, smaller but clear. Her arms rang with the impact, a vibration that traveled from her wrists to her shoulders and told her she had no idea what she was doing and no choice but to keep doing it. She hit the chain again and again. The sky went dark. She could not see well enough to aim properly, and she knew it. She set the hammer down. She built a small fire from pine branches near the ruins of the cabin. She sat by it and ate the piece of dry bread she had brought from town and drank water from the creek that ran along the south edge of the property. She looked at the iron door in the firelight. It looked back at her with complete indifference, the way iron always does. She thought about what her father had written. "If something happens to me before I can tell you this in person." She had read those words 3 times, and each time they had landed differently. The first time with confusion. The second time with a cold suspicion she had not wanted to name. The third time with the particular clarity that comes when you stop trying to see things the way you wish they were and start seeing them the way they are. Her father had been a healthy man. She had seen him in May before the spring floods when he had come to their small house for 2 days and eaten Emmett's cooking and sat by their fire in the evenings and talked to her about rocks and heat and the way the earth stored energy, the way a deep lake stores cold. He had been thin and he had been quieter than usual, and she had noticed that he watched the road from the window sometimes. When he thought she was not looking a particular quality of attention, that was not the casual vigilance of a man watching for a neighbor, but something more focused, something with a specific subject. He had not seemed sick. He had not seemed like a man who was going to be dead of a fever before the summer was out. She thought about Garrison Pruitt standing outside Aldous Finch's office with the studied casualness of a man who had arranged to be there. She thought about the pale, sharp eyes and the expression that had not quite made it all the way to warmth. She thought about the 2 sets of boot prints in the soft ground near the granite frame. She thought about which of those 2 sets was the familiar one and what that meant. She did not sleep much that first night. She was back at the door at first light. The days that followed had a rhythm that was brutal in its simplicity. She rose when the sky went from black to gray. She ate what she had brought from town. She worked. She stopped only when the light failed or her body demanded it, and her body demanded it later each day as it adapted to the demands she was placing on it, building the calluses and the muscle memory and the particular tolerance for discomfort that comes from choosing to do hard things repeatedly. Her hands blistered, and the blisters tore and the raw skin beneath hardened into something tougher. Her back ached in the morning and she stood up anyway and the ache faded as she moved. She was reshaping herself from the outside in and she did not think about it in those terms because there was no time for that kind of thinking. She thought about the chain and the wedges and the angle of the next blow. The town noticed. The sound of hammer on iron carries in open country, and the scratch was close enough to the edges of Greystone Pass that people could hear it in the mornings, that steady ringing that began at first light and went on long after most people had finished their breakfast. Children began walking out to the property boundary on their way home from the schoolhouse, standing in a loose cluster on the road, and watching the young widow swing her hammer at a door that would not open. They were not bad children, but children are honest in the way that adults learn to disguise, and their watching was its own kind of comment. The mole woman, one of them said, and the name spread through town. The way these things always spread quickly and completely, until a Laura Holt became in the common speech of Greystone Pass, the mole woman with a gentleness in the way the adults said it, and a bluntness in the way the children did that amounted to the same assessment delivered at different volumes. She heard it. She was not deaf. She simply continued with the work. On the third day, she walked back to Abel Cray's forge, not for more tools. She went because she was going to need to change her approach to the hinges, and she wanted to talk through the mechanics of it with someone who understood metal. And Abel Cray was the only person in Greystone Pass she believed would give her an honest answer without trying to talk her out of what she was doing in the same breath. He was working when she arrived, shaping a length of iron bar into something that would eventually be a bracket for a wagon wheel. He did not stop working when she walked in, but he adjusted the angle of his body slightly so he could see her, which was his version of an invitation to speak. She told him about the hinges. She told him they were external, set deep into the stone frame, and that the pins were her best approach. She described the gap and the angle and asked him whether the wedges she had would be sufficient, or whether she needed something with a more acute taper. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both technical, both specific. Then he reached into a bin beside his workbench and pulled out a set of wedges she had not seen before, longer and more acutely tapered than the ones he had given her. Specialized tools for a specialized problem. He set them on the bench beside her without comment. She looked at them and then at him. He said the hinges are the right move. It was the most he had said to her since she had walked into his forge the first time. Then he picked up his hammer and went back to his work. She took the wedges and walked back to the scratch, and she did not feel alone for the first time since she had arrived in Greystone Pass. On the 5th day, Garrison Pruitt came to see her. He did not come alone. He came with 2 other members of the town council men who were used to following Garrison Pruitt's lead and had arranged their faces into the same expression of pained concern that he was wearing. They stood at the edge of the property in their good coats, and they looked at the scarred granite and the dented chain and the pry marks around the hinges with an expression that managed to communicate both disapproval and satisfaction. At once the particular expression of people who have been predicting a failure, and are not entirely displeased to see it progressing toward confirmation. Pruitt spoke. He spoke about community. He spoke about concern. He spoke about the responsibilities that a town council bore toward its most vulnerable members. And he used the word vulnerable with a gentleness that was very precisely calibrated to land just short of insulting. He said that this had gone on long enough. He said that the town was prepared to revise its offer to $50, which was a substantial sum, more than fair for what the land was worth. And he said that there was a room available at Mrs. Alcott's boarding house that would suit her nicely through the winter while she made arrangements for her future. He said all of this in the tone of a man doing a kindness against his own interests, which was the most difficult tone to argue with because it wrapped the threat inside the gift. He mentioned at the end as if it were a small administrative detail rather than the point of the entire conversation, that the county had provisions for cases where a young person's mental and emotional condition rendered them unable to properly manage their affairs, and that it would pain him deeply to pursue such a course, but that the council had a duty of care that superseded individual preferences in extreme circumstances. Elara had been working while he talked. She did not stop. She drove a wedge with 3 measured blows while he outlined the boarding house arrangement, and she drove it again while he described the county's provisions. And when he finished, she set the hammer down and straightened up and turned to look at him. She looked at him for long enough that he became slightly uncomfortable, which was something she suspected did not happen to Garrison Pruitt very often. She said that she appreciated his concern. She said it the way her father had taught her to say things she did not mean, which was to say them clearly and simply, and without the kind of embellishment that signals insincerity. Then she said that this was her property, and that she was working on it, which was the most ordinary thing a person could do on their own land, and that she would thank him to leave her to it. She picked up the hammer. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. The mask did not slip so much as it shifted, the warmth draining away like water leaving a glass, leaving behind the pale, sharp eyes and the cold calculation she had seen outside the lawyer's office. He looked at her the way a man looks at an obstacle he has underestimated and is now revising his plans to accommodate. Then he put his mask back on, and he said he would leave her to it. And he turned and walked back toward town, with his 2 council members falling into step behind him, like a pair of shadows that had forgotten how to cast their own. She watched them go. Then she turned back to the door, and she hit the wedge again harder than she had hit anything all week because her hands were shaking slightly. And the only thing that helped with that was motion. That night she sat by her fire and read her father's journal. By the light of it, turning the pages carefully in the cold, stopping at the passages that seemed important, reading the temperature readings and the geological notes, and trying to understand the shape of what he had built. The numbers told her something. The temperature at the surface of the scratch was what you would expect for a Wyoming autumn at this elevation, cold and getting colder. But the numbers he had recorded at various depths below the surface told a different story. A story of warmth that increased steadily as he descended. Warmth that plateaued at 40 feet. In a way that was not the natural result of simple geothermal gradient, but something more concentrated, something that suggested a specific geological feature beneath this particular patch of ground. She thought about the word warmth, underlined 3 times. She pressed her palm flat against the cold granite beside the iron door. The stone pulled the heat out of her hand. the way cold stone always does. But at the junction between the granite frame and the surrounding earth, where her father had laid the stone into the ground, with such precision she felt something slightly different. Not warm, not in any way that would make you say out loud, "That is warm," but less cold than it should be. The difference between a stone that has been lying in open air all night and a stone that has been lying against something that is slightly warmer than the surrounding ground. It was the smallest possible evidence of the largest possible promise. She put more wood on the fire and leaned against the cold granite and looked up at the Wyoming sky. The stars coming out in their usual extravagance, too many to count, too cold to seem warm, and thought about her father sitting in this same spot in summer nights watching these same stars, knowing what he knew building what he had built, and keeping his own counsel with the patience of a man who was certain he was right and content to wait. She was not her father. She did not have his patience or his certainty. She had something different. The specific stubbornness of a woman who has run out of alternatives and found at the bottom of the barrel a single note in her father's handwriting saying, "Trust the deep warmth," and who has decided that the note is enough. She would trust it. She would go down. She would take the 40 steps and see for herself if the earth kept its promises. The decision settled something in her that had been unsettled since July. Not the grief which was still there, and would be there for a long time. A stone in the chest that breathing had to work around. But the uncertainty, the sense of standing at a crossroads in the dark with no light in any direction. The decision made a direction. The direction made a reason to get up in the morning. The reason made everything else possible. She picked up the hammer. The sound rang out across the scratch and came back from the tree line, small but clear. And somewhere in Greystone Pass, a child said, "The mole woman is still at it." And a mother said, "Come away from the window now." And the night settled over Wyoming the way it always did, indifferent and vast and cold, while in the heart of a patch of ground that everyone agreed was worthless, something was waiting 40 steps down, patient as stone, warm as the core of the earth, keeping a promise that a dead man had made to his daughter, in the only language he trusted, the language of deep things, the language of what the earth remembers. The 6th day was the day the chain broke. She would remember it that way, not as the culmination of 6 days of labor, but as a single sound, a crack like a rifle shot that crossed the empty land and startled 2 crows out of the nearest pine and sent them wheeling up into the gray sky, with their outraged voices trailing behind them. She stood with the sledgehammer still in her hands and looked at the chain where the fractured link had finally given way, the 2 ends swinging apart and falling to the cold ground on either side of the door. And she felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter than either of those. Something that felt like confirmation. Like the world saying, "Yes, you were right about this, which is different from winning and more important." She set the hammer down. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs, feeling the ache in her palms where the skin had hardened and cracked and hardened again over the past days. She looked at the door. The great rusted padlock was still hanging through the iron ring, still a solid mass of fused corrosion. still entirely convincing as a barrier to anyone who did not know it was a decoy. She left it exactly where it was. It was still doing the job her father had designed it to do, which was to make a person look at the lock rather than the hinges. She picked up the pry bar and went to work on the hinges. This is what those 8 days were laid out plainly. 6 days to break the chain and 3 to work the hinge pins with some overlap in the middle, where she pursued both approaches at once, the hammer and the wedges alternating with the pry bar, in a rhythm that her body found and then kept without her having to think about it. The work was not complicated. It was simply hard in the way that most important things are not complicated, but simply hard, requiring less intelligence than endurance, less strategy than the willingness to come back to the same cold ground every morning and begin again. She rose each day when the sky went from black to the particular deep blue that precedes gray. The color of cold water, the color of the hour before the sun decides whether to bother. She ate what she had. Dry bread the first few days, then cornmeal. Porridge cooked over her small fire, then salt pork when she made the walk into town for supplies, carrying her dwindling money in a tin in her coat pocket, and spending it with the careful precision of someone who knows the difference between enough and not enough, and is not yet certain which side of that line she is on. The town watched her come and go. She felt it rather than saw it, the slight pause in conversations as she passed, the glances that moved away just before she could catch them directly. She was becoming a story, which is the thing that happens to people in small places when they behave in ways that confuse or unsettle the established order of things. A story gives the town something to do with you, a way to hold you at a manageable distance while still keeping track of you. The story the town of Greystone Pass was telling about Elara Holt was the story of a grieving young widow who had been unhinged by loss, which was sympathetic but not serious, and which came with an implied ending that involved her eventually giving up and leaving. She bought her supplies and walked back to the scratch, and did not speak more than necessary to anyone, and the story continued without her participation, which is how stories in small towns generally work. The memories came in the evenings. She had not expected that. She had expected the days to be consumed entirely by the physical demands of the work, leaving no room for anything else, the body crowding out the mind through sheer exhaustion. And the days were like that. But the evenings when the light failed, and she built her fire and sat beside it waiting for sleep, the evenings opened up in ways she could not close off. Emmett came first. He came the way he always did in those months after his death, not in the grand moments of grief, but in the small, precise details that catch you off guard. The specific way he had of tilting his head when he was listening to something he was not sure he believed. The smell of pine resin that clung to his work clothes. The sound of his breathing in the dark when they were both almost asleep, and the house was quiet around them. He had been a good man, not a complicated man, not a man who underlined words 3 times or kept secrets for a decade, or built things in the dark that no one else understood. Just a good man who had loved her straightforwardly and been taken from her by a river that had not asked his opinion about the matter. She let herself think about him without trying to manage the thinking, which was the approach she had developed in the worst of the early weeks, and which she still needed sometimes. It did not get smaller, this missing him. She had been told it would get smaller. But what actually happened, she was finding, was that you got larger, your life expanding slowly around the fixed size of the grief, until it occupied a smaller percentage of the total, though it did not change in itself. You grew. It stayed the same. The ratio shifted. This was happening slowly and unevenly, and she was not always sure it was happening at all. Her father came in the evenings too, different from Emmett. Walter Holt had always been a presence more than a comfort, a mind you were aware of more than a warmth you could settle into. He had loved her in the way of people who are slightly outside the ordinary world, a love that expressed itself in what he taught her, rather than what he said to her in the geology lessons at the kitchen table, and the long walks he had taken her on as a child, where he would crouch beside an exposed rock face and show her how to read time in the layers. He had not been easy to know, and he had not been good at the ordinary forms of closeness. But he had built something for her with 10 years of his life. He had built it alone in the cold on a piece of land that everyone agreed was worthless, and he had done it because he had seen something no one else had seen, and he had decided that his daughter should have it. She thought about that in the evenings, about what it meant to be loved in a language you could not speak back, about the things that people build instead of saying. On the morning of the 7th day, she found the frost. She had been at the door since first light, working the wedges into the gap around the upper hinge pin, when something made her stop and look down at the ground around the granite frame. It was the kind of October morning when the frost was heavy on everything, the grass white and stiff, the pine needles coated in a fine crystalline layer that caught the thin, early light and held it. The stones on the ground around her were silver with it. The fallen timbers of the old cabin were furred with white. The earth itself was hard, the top layer frozen solid, in the way that told her the deeper freezing was coming soon. The permafrost of a Wyoming winter working its way down from the surface. But around the granite frame of the door, in a band perhaps 8 inches wide, running along all 4 sides, there was no frost. None. The ground in that narrow perimeter was merely cold, the kind of cold that is a natural temperature rather than a hard freeze. The granite itself was cold to the touch, the way stone always is, but not the bone-deep cold of stone that has been sitting in open air at 20 degrees all night. It was as if something below, something steady and constant and indifferent to the season, was maintaining a slight counterpressure against the cold descending from above. She pressed her palm flat against the earth in that unfrozen band. Cool. Just cool. She pressed her palm against the frozen ground a foot away, and the difference was immediate and unmistakable. She moved slowly around the entire perimeter of the frame, pressing her hand to the ground at intervals, confirming what she had seen. It held. Perfect, consistent, a ring of not quite frozen earth around the boundary of what her father had built. The geothermal gradient, he had said to her once when she was 6 years old, and had asked why the root cellar stayed warm in winter. A phrase no one else in Greystone Pass had ever uttered. He had explained it to her while she sat on the kitchen counter and swung her legs and ate an apple, explaining the earth, the way he always did as a living thing with its own logic and its own heat, its skin cold where it met the air, but its core burning with a steady ancient fire that had nothing to do with the sun, and everything to do with what the planet was made of and what happened to it over deep geological time. He had used words she could not have repeated at 6, but which had given her a feeling, a sense of the ground beneath her feet, as something alive and warm and inexhaustibly patient. She stood up. She looked at the unfrozen ring around the door. Her father had not been digging a root cellar. He had found something. He had found the place where the earth's own heat was close enough to the surface to matter close enough to make a difference in the winter arithmetic of survival. He had spent 10 years carefully, methodically excavating and finishing the access to it, building the steps and the chambers with the patience of a man who understood geological time, because he had spent his life studying it. She thought, "I'm going to get that door open." She picked up the hammer and went back to the hinges. It was that evening, with the last light fading and her arms burning and the upper hinge pin showing the first signs of genuine movement, that she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the road. She straightened and turned, holding the pry bar in both hands, not as a weapon, but because setting it down would have required more thought than she had available. It was Abel Cray. He was not wearing his work apron, which meant he had come after closing the forge for the day. He had his coat on and his hat pulled down against the cold, and he was carrying something in his left hand, a folded piece of paper, which he held with a kind of deliberate care that told her it was important before he said anything at all. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the door, and then at her, and then at the door again, the way a craftsman looks at work in progress, assessing it without judgment. Then he looked at the paper in his hand. He said he had something to tell her, and he wanted to tell her straight out without making it into something longer than it needed to be. She waited. He said that 3 days after she had first come to his forge, Garrison Pruitt had come to see him. Pruitt had offered him money, a specific amount that Abel named without flinching, to provide a daily account of Elara's progress on the property. What she was doing, how far along she was, whether she seemed close to giving up. Abel had listened to the offer. He had taken a day to think about it. Then he had accepted. He said this, looking at her directly, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has decided that the cleanest path through a shameful thing is a straight line. He said he had sent 2 reports. Then he had stopped, and instead of sending a third, he had come here. He said he could tell her that he had doubted himself from the second day, which was true, or he could tell her the reason he had finally decided to stop, which was simpler. He said, "You told me you would pay me. Not that you would try. Not that you hope to. You said you would pay me the way a person says something when they are not saying what they want to happen, but what they know is going to happen." He said he was not a man who was easily impressed by that kind of certainty, and he was more impressed by it than he wanted to be. He held out the folded paper. She took it. She unfolded it carefully. It was a note handwritten on Pruitt's personal stationery, the kind with the embossed letterhead that men of a certain kind of vanity use, because they believe their name on fine paper carries a weight that their name on plain paper does not. It outlined in Pruitt's smooth and precise handwriting exactly what he wanted from Abel. The daily reports, the assessment of Elara's progress, and the specific request to be notified the moment she showed signs of abandoning the effort or of accessing whatever lay beneath the door. He had signed it with his full name, Garrison Pruitt, in the same confident embossed ink as the letterhead. It was the note of a man who had not considered the possibility that the person he was paying might have second thoughts. Elara read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, in the same pocket where she kept her father's letters. She looked at Abel. He said he would help her with the hinges if she wanted. He said it simply without making it into an apology or a gesture, the way he said everything as a plain statement of available fact. She said she wanted. She showed him where she was with the upper pin, and he crouched beside her and looked at the angle and the progress and ran his thumb along the edge of the wedge slot in a way that communicated more about the remaining work than any words would have. He told her 3 things about the approach she had been taking, 2 observations and 1 correction, and all 3 were right. She could tell they were right. The way you can tell when someone who understands something is talking about the thing they understand. They worked together until full dark. The upper pin moved another 1/4 inch. When they stopped, Abel looked at the progress and said, "Tomorrow." It meant the pin would be out tomorrow. It was the most optimistic thing she had heard since she had arrived in Greystone Pass. He walked back to town in the dark. She built her fire and ate her supper, and sat with the note in her pocket, and thought about Garrison Pruitt's embossed letterhead, and what it told her not just about Pruitt, but about the value of what lay beneath the door. Men like Pruitt did not spend money to monitor things they believed were worthless. They spent money to monitor things that threatened to become valuable in the hands of someone who was not them. She thought about what her father had written about the person who had sent men to survey the ground around the door to look at it and go away. She thought about the speed with which Pruitt had appeared outside Aldous Finch's office. She thought about boot prints in soft ground. She was not, she realized, only fighting for her inheritance. She was fighting for something her father had died protecting. She put more wood on the fire. Doc Harrow came to the scratch the next morning. She had seen him only twice since arriving in Greystone Pass, once at a distance on the main street, and once outside Finch's office where he had been standing when she left, looking at her with the expression of a man who wants to say something and has decided this is not the moment. She had noted him both times in the way her father had taught her to note things, without pressing, without drawing conclusions, just observing and filing. He arrived at the scratch on foot, which told her something about his intentions. A man who does not want to be seen arriving somewhere, walks rather than rides. He came across the open ground from the road with his black bag in one hand and his hat pulled low against the morning cold. And he stopped about 10 feet from her and looked at the door and then at her without preamble. He said he had something to show her that he should have shown her sooner. He sat down on a flat granite outcropping and opened his black bag and took out a folder of papers that he handled with the careful neutrality of someone presenting evidence rather than offering comfort. He set them on the stone beside him and gestured for her to look. They were medical notes, his own handwriting neat and functional in the way of a professional who writes to record rather than to impress. She read them slowly, not all of it because some of it was in the shorthand of clinical notation, but enough. The date, her father's name, the presenting symptoms, the progression, the timeline. She read it through twice, and then sat back and looked at the Wyoming sky above her for a moment, letting the cold air move across her face. The timeline was wrong, not by a great deal, but by enough. And when you knew what you were looking for, the wrongness was clear. The kind of fever that killed a man, in the way Walter's death had been recorded, required a specific progression that did not match what Doc Harrow had written on the day he had been called to the house. The symptoms were consistent with something, but not with the thing on the death certificate. She looked at Doc Harrow. He said he had signed the certificate. He said this without excusing it, which was the honest way to say it. He said that on the evening in question, he had received a message at his home that Walter Holt had taken ill and was asking for him, and he had gone immediately to the house on the edge of town that Walter used when he was not at the scratch. He said that when he arrived, Garrison Pruitt was already there. He paused for a moment. He said Pruitt had explained that he had happened to be nearby and had found Walter collapsed inside and had sent for the doctor. He said Walter had been beyond meaningful communication by the time he arrived, and that the situation had progressed quickly, and that Pruitt had stayed through the night and had been on the surface the model of a concerned community member, attending to a neighbor in distress. He said that the following morning, before Doc Harrow had completed his standard post-mortem examination, Pruitt had come to his office and asked when the death certificate would be ready, because the family needed to be notified and arrangements needed to be made. He had used the word arrangements with the particular emphasis of a man for whom arrangements have a specific and practical meaning beyond the ordinary sense of the word. Doc Harrow said that he had been tired and that the symptoms had not been obviously inconsistent at first glance, and that he had let himself be hurried because Pruitt was the kind of man who made you feel that resistance was more trouble than it was worth. He said he had looked at his notes 3 weeks later when he could not sleep, and had understood what he had not let himself understand in the moment, that the timeline and the symptom progression were not quite right, that there were questions he had not asked because Garrison Pruitt had been standing in his doorway asking about the certificate. He said he could not tell her what had happened to her father with certainty, because he did not have the evidence for certainty. He said he was not a man who made accusations he could not support. But he said he was also not a man who could continue to carry what he was carrying without giving her what information he had and letting her decide what to do with it. He folded the notes and put them back in his bag. He stood up and picked up the bag and looked at the door one more time. He said he had known Walter Holt since Walter first came to Greystone Pass, which was 20 years ago, and that Walter had been the strangest and most certain man he had ever met, and that he had thought at the time that certainty of that particular kind usually ended badly. He looked at her and said he was not so sure about that now. Then he walked back across the open ground toward the road, without looking back the way a man walks when he has said what he came to say and does not need anything in return for it. Elara stood by the iron door for a long time after he was gone. The cold worked at her face and hands with its usual patient industry. A hawk moved in slow circles over the far end of the property, riding a thermal that she could not see. She thought about her father in his house on the edge of Greystone Pass, working on the last of his documents, watching the road from his window. She thought about boot prints in soft ground and a man who had been there before the doctor. She thought about a death certificate signed in a hurry by a tired physician and a community that had been in too much of a hurry to ask questions about an old eccentric that no one had been paying much attention to anyway. She picked up the pry bar and went back to the hinges. The upper pin came out at 4 o'clock that afternoon with a sound that was less dramatic than the chain breaking a low groan of corroded metal, finally releasing the pin, sliding out of its hole and into her waiting hand in a slow, almost reluctant movement. She held it for a moment, looking at the reddish brown of the oxidation on its surface, the dense iron of it solid and heavy in her palm. It was the first piece of the door she had separated from the door. It felt like a declaration. Abel arrived an hour later, as he had taken to doing after the forge closed. He looked at the removed pin and nodded once. Then he went to the lower hinge without being asked and set to work with the wedges. She took the upper hinge position, and they worked in a parallel rhythm, the two of them moving around the massive door in a loose choreography of effort that had developed over the past 2 days without either of them designing it. The way competent people working together develop a shared language without discussing it. The lower pin was more resistant. The hours wore down. The temperature dropped. Abel did not leave, which was its own kind of statement. And she did not thank him, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The fire she kept going between work sessions put out enough heat to keep their fingers functional, if not comfortable. At some point in the late evening, with both of them working by firelight, Abel said, without looking up from the lower hinge, "Pruitt came to see me again this morning." She kept her eyes on the wedge she was setting. Abel said that Pruitt had asked why the reports had stopped, that Pruitt had been smooth about it as he always was. But there had been something underneath the smoothness, a pressure the way water builds up behind a dam, and you can feel the dam beginning to flex before you can see it. Abel said he had told Pruitt that she had given up and gone back to town, which had not been true, and that Pruitt had looked at him for a moment in the way of a man deciding whether to believe something or punish you for saying it, and had then left without the satisfaction of either option. Elara said he'll find out soon enough. Abel said yes. Then he went back to the lower hinge. 20 minutes later, the lower pin surrendered. It came out faster than the upper one, the corrosion less severe. At that joint, the metal giving way in a long single motion that left the pin in Abel's hand, and the door standing in its granite frame with nothing anchoring it except its own weight, and the rust in the seam between iron and stone. They looked at it. The massive door, impenetrable and absolute for a decade now, held in place by nothing more than inertia and oxidation. Abel fitted the heavy pry bar into the seam at the edge of the door. He looked at her. She put her hands on the bar beside his. They leaned into it together with everything they had, and for a long moment nothing moved. And then, with a sound that she would remember for the rest of her life, a long, grinding, metallic protest that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the door itself. The iron slab swung outward, not far. 6 inches. 8. Enough. The air that came through the gap was not what she expected. She had been prepared for damp and rot and the cold underground smell of a sealed space long closed. What came out was something else entirely. It was cool, but not cold. The particular temperature of a deep place that has never been touched by either summer heat or winter freeze. It was clean in a way that outdoor air in October is not quite clean, carrying no decay, no moisture, no trace of the biological activity of the surface world. It carried instead something she could only describe as stone, the deep mineral scent of rock that has not seen light in geological time. A smell that was ancient in the way that very few things you encounter in ordinary life are actually ancient. And beneath that, below the coolness and the stone smell, something else. Something that was not quite warmth yet, but was the promise of warmth. The way you can feel the approach of a fire before you can feel the heat itself. She pressed both hands flat against the door and pushed. Abel pushed beside her. The door moved further a foot, 2 feet, the hinges gone, and nothing now to resist the swing except the weight of the iron itself. They pushed until the door was fully open. Standing perpendicular to its frame, the black rectangle of the entrance fully revealed. She stood at the edge of it. The air moved against her face like breathing, slow and steady and constant. It was the temperature of a root cellar in May, neither warm nor cold, something between. She lit her prepared torch. The flame caught and steadied, and she looked down into the opening and saw the first few steps cut into the stone spiraling downward, each one precise and level. The work of a man who had been in no hurry and had made no concessions to convenience. The walls of the stairwell were smooth stone, dry to the eye, the torchlight moving across them in warm and shifting patterns. Abel stood behind her. He did not speak. She appreciated that. This was not a moment for speaking. She put her foot on the first step. She counted them as she went, her voice barely above a whisper. In the silence of the shaft, the torchlight steady in the still air. 10 steps down, and the sound of the surface world was already gone. The wind and the creak of the pines and the distant sounds of a town making its way through the evening. All of it simply absent, replaced by a silence that was not empty, but full, the way very deep places are full of their own particular presence. 20 steps and the quality of the air changed again, the coolness receding slightly, the warmth she had been promised, beginning to make itself felt, not as a temperature she could name, but as an absence of cold. 30 steps, and she was aware of something she could only describe as the earth, breathing a barely perceptible movement in the air, rising from below, with a regularity that was not quite mechanical and not quite natural, but something in between, the rhythm of a geological process that had been running for longer than anything human on the surface above. 35 steps, 36, 37. The warmth became real. Not warm the way a fire is warm, not the sharp confrontation of direct heat. Warm the way a sleeping body is warm, radiating from within constant and body temperature, and somehow personal, as if the earth had a temperature that matched her own. 38, 39, 40. She stopped on a level stone floor and held the torch up and looked at what her father had built. The chamber was circular, perhaps 20 feet across the ceiling, vaulting upward in a dome that her torchlight barely reached. The walls were the same dressed stone as the stairwell, each block fitted to its neighbor, with the precision of a craftsman who understood that the quality of the joint was the whole of the work. No mortar, no filler, just stone against stone in tolerances so close that she could not slide a piece of paper between them. The floor was paved in flat stone flags, swept clean, no debris, as if her father had left it in order, which she realized after a moment he had, because he had known someone was going to come here after him, and he had wanted that someone to see it as it was meant to be. In the center of the floor, cut through the stone like a well, was a shaft approximately 6 feet across, covered by a heavy iron grate through which the warmth was rising. She could see nothing in the shaft, only darkness descending further than her torchlight reached. But from it came the air she had been feeling since she opened the door, steady and warm, and carrying that deep mineral cleanness. And when she knelt and pressed her palms against the grate, she felt the warmth move through her hands and up her arms like the first real warmth she had felt in months, maybe years. The warmth of a fire that did not need wood and would not go out. The chamber opened on 3 sides into arched corridors, each perhaps 8 feet wide and several feet deep. The arches fitted in the same close stonework as the walls. They were empty. They were waiting. She sat down on the stone floor beside the grate. The warmth moved around her like something alive surrounding her. Without pressing on her, the temperature of deep summer held underground where no winter could reach it. Her torch burned steadily, no draft to move it, the flames straight and clear in the still air. She thought about her father digging this. Not digging the way a man digs a well, functional and urgent and utilitarian. Digging the way a man builds something he wants to last beyond himself, every stone chosen and cut and fitted with care. Every dimension considered, the whole of it designed not just to function, but to endure. He had been down here in the dark, working by torchlight, the way she was now, fitting stone to stone with his careful hands. And he had been doing it for her, not for the town, not for posterity, not for the advancement of geological science, for his daughter who would need somewhere to be warm when the world above was cold and the people in it had decided she was a burden rather than a person. He had known she would need it. He had known it before she knew it herself, because he had been watching the world she was going to inherit with a geologist's patience and a father's fear. And he had done what he could do with the time and the skills he had. He had given her the earth's own warmth, because it was the only warmth he knew how to give that could not be taken away, not be. She did not cry the way she had cried in the weeks after Emmett. This was different. The grief she had carried since July, the grief that was specifically for her father, which she had not fully let herself feel in those months, because there had been no room for it alongside the grief for Emmett and the grief for her own circumstances. This grief moved through her now with a specific and necessary force. She wept for the strange, solitary man who had read rocks instead of ledgers and spent 10 years in the dark building her a kingdom. She wept for the last entry in his journal. I wish I had told her more. She wept for the fact that she had been close enough in May, had sat with him by a fire and watched him watch the road, and had not known to ask the question that would have opened all of this. But underneath the grief was something else, something that was larger and more durable. A feeling she did not have a precise name for, that was partly gratitude and partly awe, and partly the specific sensation of being loved by someone in a way that exceeds what you believed was possible. She had been loved by Emmett in the language of presence and ordinary days, and a hand reaching for hers in the dark. She had been loved by her father in the language of 10 years of labor 40 feet below the surface of the world, in dressed stone and geothermal warmth, and a padlock that was not a padlock at all but a feint, a misdirection, a layer of protection built by a man who understood that the things worth protecting were worth protecting carefully. She sat on the warm stone floor for a long time. Above her, the Wyoming night was spreading itself over the scratch with its customary indifference. The temperature dropping toward the single digits, the frost moving across the ground with patient efficiency, covering everything it could reach. It covered the unfrozen ring around the granite frame last, finding its boundary and stopping there, defeated by the same slow warmth from below that had been holding it at bay since long before Elara was born. Abel Cray stood at the top of the steps for a while, feeling the warmth rising past him from below. He did not call down. He did not need to know what she had found, to understand that it was real, because the warmth was real, rising out of the Wyoming October, like a conversation between the deep earth and the surface world, steady and constant, and absolutely indifferent to the season. He had spent 30 years working metal, learning the properties of things, understanding what materials could and could not do. And he understood that what he was feeling was not the warmth of a fire or a stove or any human-made heat. This was something else. This was the earth doing something the earth was already doing, had been doing since before there was anyone to feel it. And a man with a precise mind and a patient disposition had found the place where it was close enough to reach. He sat down on the cold stone beside the open door and waited. When she came back up the 40 steps, her face in the torchlight was wet and clear, and composed in a way it had not been before she went down. She looked like someone who has been told something important and has had the time to understand it. She looked like someone who has been handed something and has weighed it and found it heavier and more real than she expected, and has decided she is going to be strong enough to carry it. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at the open sky and breathed the cold surface air, which after the warmth below felt sharp and thin and provisional. The air of a world that could not be trusted to stay warm on its own. Abel did not ask her what she had found. He looked at her face and understood that she would tell him when she was ready, and that she did not owe him the telling before then. She sat down on the cold ground beside the open door and looked out across the scratch at the dark shapes of the twisted pines against the darker sky, and she said quietly to herself as much as to him, "He built it for me." Abel Cray, who was not a man given to sentiment, and who had spent 30 years cultivating a practical relationship with the world that left no room for what could not be weighed or measured, looked at the warm air rising from the open door, and thought about a strange old man who had commissioned odd iron fittings and paid for them without explanation, and had spent 10 years alone on a piece of land that everyone agreed was worthless. He said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. He sat with her in the cold and the silence until she was ready to move, and the warmth rose past them both into the Wyoming night. Patient and constant and inexhaustible 40 steps below the surface of a world that was growing colder by the hour, keeping the promise that Walter Holt had spent the last years of his life making to his daughter in the only language that outlasted him. She moved in on a Tuesday. There was not much to move. A bedroll and 2 wool blankets, a cast iron skillet and a tin pot, a box of provisions she had assembled with the care of someone who has counted their money twice and knows that what they have is what there is: dried beans and salt pork, and a sack of cornmeal, and a smaller sack of coffee. Her father's journals wrapped in the oilskin tied with the leather cord, the iron chest, 2 changes of clothing and the coat she was already wearing, a box of candles and the small stove she had purchased from Abel, a compact, beautifully made thing he had built himself from sheet metal, with a pipe that ran up the stairwell to vent at the surface. It was not for heat. She did not need heat. It was for cooking and for light, and those 2 things were enough. She carried it all down the 40 steps in 4 trips, her boots finding the rhythm of the stairwell easily. Now the descent becoming familiar, the way routes become familiar. not requiring thought but allowing it. Each trip she paused at the bottom and felt the warmth settle around her, like a hand placed on a shoulder, steady and present, and without demand. It was the same each time. It would be the same in January, in February, in the worst of what Wyoming could bring down on a person through the long months of a high country winter. This was its nature. It did not fluctuate. It did not depend on wood or coal or the price of either. It simply was, as the earth beneath her feet simply was patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the weather of the surface world. She installed the small stove in the main chamber, fitting the pipe sections together and running them up along the wall of the stairwell with the brackets Abel had made for her. Each bracket bolted into the stone of the wall at precise intervals, the pipe rising clean and straight to the surface. She lit a small fire and watched the smoke move up through the pipe and disappear, and then she stood in the warmth of the main chamber, with firelight moving on the stone walls and the deep heat rising from the grate in the floor. And she understood for the first time what her father had meant when he wrote the word warmth 3 times and underlined it. He had not been talking only about temperature. He had been talking about the particular quality of this place, the way it surrounded you without pressing on you, the way it asked nothing and gave everything the way it felt, if you stood in it long enough like being held. She thought about the 3 arched corridors leading off the main chamber. She walked into each of them with her candle and measured them with her arms and her pace and her eye. 2 of them were roughly the same size each, perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The ceilings vaulted and the walls dressed stone clean and dry and waiting. The 3rd was slightly larger, perhaps 15 feet deep, and had along one wall a series of stone shelves fitted into the rock at varying heights, the work of a man who had thought about practical storage as well as warmth. She set her provisions on the lower shelves. She noted that the temperature in this corridor was slightly cooler than the main chamber, perhaps 2 or 3 degrees, the warmth from the grate not quite reaching its full depth. She nodded at the practical wisdom of it, a natural cold pantry within a warm house. She put her bedroll in the smaller of the 2 remaining corridors. She hung her 2nd coat on a bracket her father had fitted into the wall at shoulder height, as if he had known she would need exactly that. She set the iron chest against the wall beside her bedroll within arm's reach of where she would sleep. She put the journals on the stone shelf her father had cut into the wall at the head of the sleeping space, neatly arranged by volume, the way he had kept everything. She sat down on her bedroll and looked at the main chamber through the arch. The stove was burning quietly. The firelight played on the curved walls and the vaulted ceiling and the fitted stones, bringing out the subtle colors in the rock. The gray and rust and pale gold of Wyoming granite colors you did not see in ordinary light, because ordinary light was too blunt for them. The air held steady around her. The silence was complete, a silence without the anxious quality of surface silence, which always contained the possibility of wind or voices or the distant sounds of other lives. This was a different kind of silence, the silence of depth, the silence of something that has been here long enough to have stopped needing to prove it. She was not afraid. She had expected to be afraid, or at least uneasy, in the way that the mind resists what the body does not recognize as familiar. But the body recognized this. The body relaxed in ways she had not felt it relax since before Emmett had died. The tight coil of sustained vigilance that had lived in her chest for months, beginning slowly to loosen. She lay back on the bedroll and looked at the stone ceiling. She thought, I am home. The days that followed had a different quality from the days of labor on the door. Those days had been driven by urgency, by the knowledge of the approaching winter, and the dwindling money and the pressure of Pruitt's cold eyes, and the town's impatient pity. These days had a steadiness to them, the particular rhythm of building rather than fighting the work of making a place livable, rather than winning the right to enter it. She rigged a rope system for hauling water from the creek, a slow and imperfect solution, but a functional one until she could devise better. She organized the provisions and calculated how long they would last and what she would need to supplement them with. She read her father's journals in the evenings by the stove light, working through the technical passages with a patience she had not had for them before. Because now she understood what she was reading about, could feel it around her as she read, and the mathematics of it made a different kind of sense when you were sitting inside the thing being described. She found vegetables stayed fresh longer on the cooler shelves in the third corridor than they would have in any root cellar she had ever used. The steady temperature, neither warm enough to promote decay, nor cold enough to freeze and damage, preserved things in a way that was almost uncanny. Carrots she had bought in Greystone Pass 2 weeks ago were still firm and bright-colored. Apples she had set there on the first day were unchanged. She thought about this. She thought about the implications of it for a family trying to winter in a place like Wyoming, the enormous weight of food preservation that this could lift. She thought about the letter in the iron chest, the sealed envelope with her father's instruction, written on the outside, open only after you reach the bottom. She had not forgotten it. She was not ready to open it yet for reasons she did not fully examine. It was the last thing from him she did not know, and she was not ready to know it yet, which was perhaps irrational, but was also, she felt, hers to decide. Above her, the sky over Greystone Pass was doing what the old men in town had been saying it was gonna do. She could feel it in the way the air at the top of the stairwell had changed quality, a sharpness to it that had not been there in October, a specific weight that experienced people recognized as the weight of weather building. She went to the surface every morning to maintain the ventilation opening and to collect whatever she needed from outside, and each morning the world was slightly more contracted. The colors more muted, the clouds lower and heavier, and more deliberate in their organization across the sky. The animals had gone still. The hawk that had been working the thermals over the scratch was gone. The crows had left the pines. The creek was running slower each day, ice forming along its edges in the night, and retreating only partially by midday. She was on the surface one morning mid-November by her reckoning when she saw 2 deer moving across the far edge of the property. They were moving quickly, not browsing, but traveling the particular purposeful movement of animals that have decided something and are acting on it. They were moving south away from the high country, and they were moving as if away from something rather than towards something which was a different and more urgent motivation. She watched them go over the ridge and disappear. She went back down the 40 steps. 3 days later, the White Death came to Greystone Pass. She heard it before she felt it, or rather, she felt a change in the quality of the air that reached her from the surface before the storm itself arrived in any form she could have named. The chamber itself was unchanged as it always was and always would be. But something moved through her that was not temperature. A kind of atmospheric pressure that the deep earth was apparently immune to, but that her body, trained by 22 years of surface life, registered as a change in the world above. She climbed the 40 steps and stood at the top and looked at the sky. It was a color she had not seen before. Not gray, not white, not the usual pewter of a Wyoming storm sky. It was the color of a very old bruise, a purple gray so dense it seemed to have weight beyond what clouds normally had, the kind of sky that made the air beneath it feel diminished and compressed. The wind was not gusting. It was not doing anything dramatic. It was simply there, a steady, enormous, implacable river of cold moving from the northwest at a speed and consistency that was somehow more frightening than any gust could have been, because gusts are intermittent and this was not. This was committed. This was the weather deciding something and following through. She went back down the 40 steps. She brought with her the last of the items she had left near the surface entrance. She secured the ventilation grate. She went to the main chamber and sat by the stove and listened. For a while, she heard nothing. The silence of the underground was complete as always. Then gradually she became aware of a sound she had not heard before. From down here, a very faint, very high whistling, coming from somewhere at the top of the stairwell. The wind finding the ventilation gap and making something of it, a thin, distant keening that was the only evidence of the world above. She sat by the stove and listened to it, and thought about what it meant, that she could hear the storm only as a whisper from 40 feet below its surface. She cooked a meal. She ate it deliberately, tasting what she ate, rather than simply consuming it, which was a small act of deliberateness in the face of whatever was happening above. She washed the pan and the tin plate. She set more wood in the stove. She took her father's journals from the shelf and read, working through the volume that detailed the construction of the chamber, the calculations for the ventilation system, and the drainage and the structural load of the stone dome above. The storm raged for a day and then another, and she knew it only as that thin, high sound from the top of the stairwell, changing in pitch as the wind changed direction, a remote and impotent commentary on a fury that could not reach her. She had thought she might feel guilty about this, the warmth and safety of her position, against whatever the people in the town above her were experiencing. She found that she felt instead a profound and specific gratitude toward her father, toward the 10 years of lonely work that had made this possible, toward the mind that had looked at a piece of ground that everyone else had dismissed and had understood what it was. She was reading late in the second evening of the storm when she heard something that was not the wind. It was a sound from the stairwell, not the faint whistling of the gale through the ventilation gap. Something else lower and more specific. A series of sounds that were irregular and halting, the sounds of something moving on the stairs, moving with difficulty, moving the way things move when they are almost done moving and are not certain they can continue. She took the candle and went to the foot of the stairwell and looked up. A shape at the top of the stairs, too large for a deer or a coyote and moving in a way that was neither animal nor quite fully human in its current state. A person reduced by extremity to something more elemental. A body making itself keep moving through the operation of pure stubbornness in the absence of anything more sophisticated. She could hear breathing now, ragged and painful, the breathing of a chest that had been fighting cold air for too long and was losing the argument. Abel Cray came down the first few steps on his hands and knees and then simply stopped, his body making the decision that his mind had been deferring for however long he had been out in that storm. He sat down heavily on the steps with his back against the wall and his head forward and his hands, even through the thick gloves he was wearing, visibly trembling. She went up the steps to him. She took his arm and put it across her shoulders and got him standing, which required more of her than she expected and less of him than she feared. And she walked him down the 40 steps into the warmth of the main chamber. She sat him in the chair she had made from a crate and a folded blanket, the one chair in her underground home, and she crouched in front of him and looked at his face. His face was white in the wrong places and red in the wrong places, the particular pattern of a man who has been very cold and is in the process of being less cold, which is a process that hurts more than the cold itself. His eyes were present, which was what mattered. He was in there. He was not so far gone that she had to worry about what she could not fix. She did not ask him anything. She put water on the stove and she warmed the leftover beans from supper. And she wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and she let the chamber do what it had been doing without interruption, since long before either of them was born, which was to move into a cold thing and make it warm. He ate the beans when she put them in front of him. He drank the hot coffee. The color came back into his face in the gradual way of a tide coming in. Not dramatic, but steady and reliable. His hands stopped trembling sometime during the second cup of coffee. The big hands that had shaped iron for 30 years finding their stillness again as the warmth reached whatever depth they had been cold to. She sat across from him on an upturned crate and waited. When he spoke, his voice was rough and had a quality she had not heard in it before. A stripped-back quality, the voice of a man who has been close enough to something permanent to have the ordinary filters temporarily removed. He said his roof had gone in the first night of the storm. A section over the bedroom, the weight of the accumulated snow, finding the one point in the structure that was not quite strong enough. He said he had packed himself in every layer he owned and gone out to try for the forge, which was a stone building and would have been survivable. He said he had made it perhaps a third of the way before understanding that he was not going to make it all the way. He said he had turned for the scratch instead, and he did not know exactly how he had gotten here, but that at some point he had been moving on his hands and knees in 3 feet of snow, with no idea which direction was which, and then his hand had hit stone. He looked around the chamber, at the vaulted ceiling and the fitted stone walls and the stove burning with its small controlled fire, and the grate in the floor with the warmth rising through it. She watched him take it in, the way he always took things in, not quickly, but completely. His craftsman's eye moving from joint to joint and surface to surface and understanding what it was seeing. He said your father cut this stone himself. She said yeah. He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the walls. Then he said there was something she needed to know. Something he had heard a week ago from Pruitt's youngest hired hand. A boy named Cutter who drank more than was wise for a boy his age, and who had said something at the saloon one evening that Abel had turned over in his mind since then, and had been trying to decide what to do with. She sat still. He said that Cutter had been talking about the federal land office, which was not the kind of thing a young hired hand usually talked about. But he had been drinking, and he was in the particular state of a young person who knows something that makes him feel important and cannot keep it contained. He had said that Pruitt kept a locked drawer in his office, which was not unusual, but that he had once seen what was in it when Pruitt had forgotten to lock it after going through its contents in a hurry. He had seen a document with a federal seal, a survey document, the kind the government sent out to assess resources on land it was considering for various purposes. The survey had been for the region around Greystone Pass, and it had been dated 1885. And the thing it had found most noteworthy in its findings was this patch of ground, this 5-acre piece of stone and wind that everyone agreed was worthless, because beneath it was a geothermal resource of unusual concentration and unusual proximity to the surface. The kind of resource that could, in the assessment of the federal surveyor, provide significant thermal energy for a community of considerable size without diminishing over any time frame relevant to human planning. She did not move. Abel said, "Pruitt has had that report for 2 years. He has had it in a locked drawer for 2 years, and the town has not seen it, and your father never knew it existed." The only person in Greystone Pass who knew what was under your father's land besides your father was Garrison Pruitt, and he knew it 2 years before your father died. The stove burned its quiet fire. The chamber held its steady temperature constant and unhurried. Above them, 40 feet of Wyoming winter. The White Death doing whatever the White Death was doing to the world up there. Down here, the fullness of a place that has no interest in urgency, because it has been here long enough to know that urgency is a surface condition. She thought about boot prints in soft ground. She thought about a man who had been at her father's house before the doctor. She thought about a death certificate signed in a hurry. She thought about the word arrangements used by a man who understood that arrangements had specific and practical meanings. She said he knew what was here. He wanted the land. My father was the only thing standing between him and it. Abel said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The logic assembled itself in the air between them without requiring comment. She sat with it for a long time. The storm pressed at the world above them and found no purchase here, the stone indifferent, as stone always is to the drama of the surface. She thought about her father in the last months of his life, watching the road from his window, writing in his journal about men who came in the night. He had been afraid, in the careful, precise way of a man who does not let fear displace thinking, but acknowledges it as useful information. He had been afraid, and he had kept working, kept building, kept filing his papers with the federal office and the territorial office, doing the things he could do against the things he could not control. He had known someone was going to try to take it. He had done what he could to ensure they could not. She stood up and went to the iron chest and took out the sealed envelope. She looked at it for a moment. Her father's handwriting on the outside, the precise angular letters, open only after you reach the bottom. She had reached the bottom. She had been here for nearly 2 weeks. She recognized, been waiting for the right moment. And the right moment was now with Abel Cray sitting across from her wrapped in a blanket, and the warmth rising from the earth below, and the storm raging above, and Garrison Pruitt's name between them, like a stone that had been turned over to reveal what lived under it. She opened the envelope. The document inside was folded in thirds, the way formal documents are folded, and it was on paper of a quality she recognized immediately as official paper, heavier and more deliberate than the paper ordinary people used for ordinary letters. She unfolded it carefully and smoothed it against her thigh and read it in the stove light. At the top, embossed in the manner of federal documents, was the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Beneath it, in the formal language of legal recognition, was a description of an invention and a claim, and a grant of exclusive rights. The inventor was identified as Walter Holt of Greystone Pass, Wyoming Territory. The filing date was March of 1886. The grant date was December of 1886, 7 months before Walter's death. The subject of the patent was described in the language of the time as a system and method for the extraction and utilization of subsurface thermal energy from geothermal formations, with specific application to the provision of thermal comfort in residential and community structures. The patent number was 47A in the Territorial Registry, cross-referenced to the Federal Registry at Washington. The language was dense and technical, and she read it slowly. But the meaning was not dense. The meaning was simple. Her father had not only found something, he had secured it. He had taken what he had built and translated it into the language that the law recognized, the language of invention and priority and exclusive right. And he had done it before anyone could stop him filing the federal paperwork in Cheyenne in the winter of 1886. And then, in the final weeks of his life, traveling again to complete the supplementary territorial registration. The separate Wyoming filing that gave the patent its full protection under both federal and territorial jurisdiction. 2 layers of protection built by a man who understood that one layer was never enough for something this valuable. The land was hers. The discovery was hers. The right to develop it, to use it, to share it, or not share it on terms of her own choosing, was hers. It had been hers since December of 1886, and would be hers until the term of the patent expired, which was longer than she needed to think about right now. Garrison Pruitt could not have bought it from her for $20 or $50 or any amount of dollars, because what she had was not simply land which could be sold and transferred, but a patent which was a different kind of property and was registered in a different kind of place and was protected by a different and considerably more powerful set of laws than the ones Garrison Pruitt was accustomed to operating within the shadow of. Walter Holt, reading rocks instead of ledgers, had outsmarted him quietly and completely, before the man had even made his first move, filing the paperwork and saying nothing, and waiting for his daughter to come find what he had left her. She held the document in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Abel said from his chair, "What is it?" She told him. She told him the date and the number and the subject and what it meant in plain terms. And she watched his face as she told it. His craftsman's face moving through comprehension to something that was not quite awe, but was the closest Abel Cray's face was capable of coming to it. It a deepening of his usual stillness into something more profound. The expression of a man who has understood something he did not know was possible to understand. He said very quietly he knew they'd come for it. She said he knew they'd come for it. They sat with that for a while, the two of them in the warm chamber, with the storm running itself out above them and the warmth rising from the deep earth below, and the document on federal paper between them, that a strange, solitary, careful man had made possible through 10 years of work and 3 months of deliberate legal preparation. The last gift of a father who had run out of time, but not out of love. It was on the second night of the storm that the second visitor came. She had been asleep in the corridor when she heard it, A sound from the stairwell that was different from Abel's arrival, different in rhythm and in what it communicated about the condition of the person making it. She came awake immediately as she had been sleeping since the storm began, with a particular alertness, and she took her candle and went to the foot of the steps. The figure coming down was not moving with Abel's desperate stumbling urgency. It was moving with the terrible deliberateness of someone who has been moving for a very long time and is almost finished. Someone whose body has been telling them to stop for hours and who has been overriding that message through a feat of will that is almost entirely spent. Each step was a negotiation. Each step was a small and separate decision. She held the candle up and saw who it was before he was halfway down. Garrison Pruitt looked nothing like the man who had stood outside Aldous Finch's office with his good wool coat and his polished boots and his carefully calibrated expression of concern. He looked like what he was, which was a man in his middle 50s who had been in a Wyoming blizzard long enough to have had everything unnecessary stripped away from him. The social performance and the calculation and the smooth authority, all of it scoured off by wind and cold and the kind of fear that does not discriminate between powerful men and ordinary ones. He was coatless, which meant he had lost it somewhere in the storm, or had never managed to put it on properly when he fled his house. His face was the wrong color in the way that Abel's had been wrong when he arrived, but more so the cold having had more time to do its work. His hands were gripping the rope she had strung along the stairwell wall as a guide, and he was gripping it the way a drowning man grips a rope, not the controlled grip of someone using a handhold, but the grip of someone for whom the rope is the only thing standing between them and the abyss. He reached the bottom of the stairs. He stood in the low warmth at the foot of the stairwell, not quite in the main chamber, and looked at her. He was beyond the particular vocabulary he normally operated in. He could not marshal a careful sentence. He could not manage his expression or calibrate his tone or make the situation into something he controlled. He was standing in the warmth that was rising from beneath the place he had tried to take from her, the warmth that had been here before him and would be here after him. And he was alive because of it. And he knew it, and there was nothing left in him to arrange that truth into something more comfortable. He did not speak. He was not capable of speech. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has had everything he normally hides behind removed. Abel had gotten up from his chair when he heard the movement on the stairs. He was standing at the arch between the sleeping corridor and the main chamber watching. He did not speak either. He looked at Elara. She looked at Garrison Pruitt standing at the bottom of her stairwell. She looked at the man who had tried to buy what her father had built for $20, the man who had paid someone to spy on her, the man who had threatened her with legal incompetence, the man who had been at her father's house before the doctor. She looked at him for a long moment, the candle in her hand casting its unsteady light on both of them. Then she stepped back from the stairwell and gestured toward the main chamber. She did not touch him. She did not speak to him. She simply indicated with her body and her gesture that there was warmth ahead, and that he was not going to be turned back out into the storm to die in it. And she waited for him to understand and move. He understood. He moved. He walked past her into the main chamber and stopped in the center of it in the warmth rising from the grate and stood there with his eyes closed and breathed. Abel looked at her with an expression that asked nothing and said everything. She gave him no particular look in return, because there was nothing particular to communicate. She had done what she had done. She would not undo it. She would not discuss it. It was the kind of decision that is made in the understanding that some decisions define you more precisely than all the rest of your decisions combined, and that it is worth knowing when that kind of decision arrives what kind of person you are. She went to the stove and put water on for coffee. The three of them occupied the underground chamber through the remainder of that night. And through the third day of the storm, which was the last of it, in an arrangement that was less awkward than it might have been, because the warmth and the silence of the place had a leveling effect on ordinary social structures. Down here, there were no hierarchies that the weather recognized. Down here, there was warm and cold, and the 40 steps between them and all three of them had needed those 40 steps for the same reason, which was that the world above had tried to kill them, and this world below had declined to cooperate. Pruitt recovered. He said nothing of substance for the entire duration of the storm, which was the wisest decision he had made in some time. He accepted the food she offered and the space he was given, and he did not attempt to manage anything. Whether this was because he was too depleted, or because he understood that managing things was not available to him in this particular situation, she could not say. She did not ask. On the third day, the whistling from the top of the stairwell stopped. She climbed the 40 steps alone and stood at the top and looked out at what the White Death had made of the world. The transformation was absolute. The landscape she had walked and worked and lived on for weeks was gone, replaced by something that had the shape of a landscape, but none of its familiar features. The contours smoothed and altered by depths of snow that made even the granite outcroppings into rounded, unrecognizable humps under white. The sky had gone from the bruised purple of the storm to a blue so clear and cold it seemed polished, the sun low and brilliant, and throwing shadows so sharp they looked cut. The air was still for the first time in 3 days, a stillness that after the constant battering of the storm felt almost loud. The particular loudness of total quiet. She could see toward Greystone Pass from the rise of the scratch. What she saw made her stand very still for a moment. Several structures were visibly compromised. Even at this distance, the shapes of roof lines wrong in ways that told her the snow's weight had done what the snow's weight did to buildings that were not strong enough to refuse it. The main street was buried to the eaves of the lower buildings. No smoke rose from most of the chimneys. She went back down the 40 steps and told Abel what she had seen. He was already moving. He had, she realized, been waiting for the storm to end with the particular alertness of a man who knows there is work ahead and is conserving himself for it. He drank the last of the morning's coffee, and he put on the layers she had dried by the stove overnight, and he looked at her and said, "I'm going to need to get to town." She said, "I know." He looked at Pruitt, who was sitting in the corner of the main chamber with his hands around a tin cup, his face having returned to something close to its ordinary color, if not to its ordinary expression. Abel said nothing to him. He went up the 40 steps. Garrison Pruitt looked at Alara across the warm chamber. There was a long silence, not an uncomfortable one exactly, more the silence of two people who are in a situation that neither of them has any precedent for, and neither of them wants to handle clumsily. Pruitt said finally in a voice that was not his usual voice, the smooth Riverstone voice of a man who has arranged his words before he speaks them, "I know what you did." She waited. He said I would not have done the same. She said, I know. He looked at the grate in the floor, the warmth rising through the iron mesh, the warmth that had been here before him and would be here after him. He looked at the fitted stone walls and the vaulted ceiling and the 3 arched corridors, the work of a man he had tried to remove from the equation of what could be taken and what could be kept. He looked at all of this for a long time with the expression of a man who is performing an accounting that has an uncomfortable balance. Then he said, your father was the most careful man I ever encountered. She said yes. He said nothing more. She did not require him to. There would be other conversations in other settings with other people present. Conversations that would not be in her control and would not be in his control either. Because the things that had happened and the documents that recorded them did not require either of their permissions to mean what they meant. Those conversations would happen in their own time and in their own way. That was not today's matter. Today's matter was the world above. She climbed the 40 steps and walked toward Greystone Pass through snow that came to her thighs in places and to her waist in the drifts, moving steadily and without hurrying, picking the path that presented the least resistance, the way her father had always picked his path, reading the terrain in front of him before committing to it. The town was not destroyed. She had feared worse from a distance, but it was damaged, and more than the physical damage was the quality of the people she encountered as she worked her way down the main street. The particular quality of a community that has been frightened past its own capacity to manage the fear and is now standing in the wreckage, trying to understand what happened and what happens next. She saw it in the faces of the men digging out doorways and the women passing water and food between households, and the children standing in the street with wide, specific eyes. She had seen this quality in people after Emmett's death, that raw nerve openness that comes when ordinary certainties have been interrupted. Abel was already at the worst of it. He moved through the disaster with the efficiency of a man who is skilled with his hands and has no patience for standing still when there is work to be done, assessing structural damage and directing the efforts of the men who gathered around him in the way of people who genuinely know what to do, in the presence of people who are grateful to be told. She worked beside him. She worked the way she had worked on the door, without drama and without stopping doing what needed doing and moving to the next thing when it was done. She helped dig out doorways. She carried supplies. She helped assess which structures were salvageable and which were not. The town watched her work with the particular attention that people pay to someone who is doing something they did not expect from them. Doc Harrow found her in the early afternoon. He was moving through the town in his own way, checking on the injured and the cold, damaged, efficient, and quiet, and carrying his black bag with the same careful neutrality as always. He stopped beside her for a moment and looked at her face and then at the document she had tucked inside her coat, the corner of it visible at her lapel. She took it out and gave it to him. He read it where he stood in the cold, and the sunlight, the snow brilliant around them. When he finished, he looked up at her, and something moved across his face that she had not seen on Doc Harrow before. Something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been relief, or might have been the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. He folded the document carefully and gave it back to her. He said there was a federal circuit judge who held court in Cheyenne on the first Tuesday of each month. He said the kind of evidence he had been carrying since the summer, combined with the kind of documents she was carrying inside her coat, would constitute a matter that a federal judge would be obliged to take seriously. He said he would make the trip to Cheyenne in the spring when the passes opened. He said he would not ask her permission because he did not think she would withhold it. She said, "Go in February. Don't wait for spring." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once with the finality of a man who has received an instruction from someone with the authority to give it, and went back to his work. The story moved through Greystone Pass, the way stories move through small places quickly and completely, and with its own momentum. And there was nothing she needed to do to help it along, except to answer questions truthfully when people asked them, which they did, in increasing numbers and with increasing specificity as the days after the storm became weeks, and the weeks revealed the full extent of both the damage and the survival. Abel told people what he had experienced. He did not embellish it, and he did not perform it. He described in his plain, precise way what had happened to his roof, and what he had decided to do, and what he had found 40 feet below the surface of the scratch. He described the stone chamber and the grate in the floor, and the warmth that rose from it in terms that were specific and technical, and utterly without mysticism, because Abel Cray was not a man given to mysticism, and the truth was remarkable enough without it. People did not believe him immediately. Then they came to the scratch and stood at the top of the stairwell and felt the warmth rising toward them from the deep earth, rising on a November day when the temperature above ground was 15 degrees below zero, and they stopped not believing him. They came to her with questions. She answered the questions. She showed them her father's journals. She showed them the patent document. She explained in the simple terms her father had once used with a 6-year-old girl in a kitchen, the geothermal gradient and what it meant, and why this particular ground was unusual in the proximity and concentration of the heat beneath it. She explained it without condescension and without impatience, the way you explain something when you understand it well enough to meet people where they are. The perception that shifted in Greystone Pass over those weeks did not shift dramatically or all at once. It shifted the way things shift when truth has enough time and enough supporting evidence, gradually and then thoroughly. The mole woman became Elara Holt, who had known something that nobody else had known, not because of madness or grief, but because she had listened to a man who had spent his life understanding things that other people walked over without noticing. She became, in the new accounting of the town, the person who had been right, which is a different and more durable kind of distinction than the person who had been lucky. Garrison Pruitt left Greystone Pass in February, the same week that Doc Harrow made the journey to Cheyenne. He left quietly, the way men of his kind prefer to leave when leaving becomes necessary, without announcement or ceremony, his departure a fact rather than an event. What the federal judge made of Doc Harrow's evidence and Elara's patent document was a matter of law and of record, and the record showed what it showed, which was enough. The authority Pruitt had exercised in Greystone Pass for the better part of 2 decades departed with him, and the space it left was not a vacuum, but a possibility, which is a better thing. 3 families came to her in the spring. They had lost their homes to the storm, or had homes so compromised by it that they would not survive another winter in them. And they came to her not for charity, but with a practical request. They wanted to know if what her father had built could be replicated on adjacent properties, whether the geothermal feature was specific to the scratch, or whether it extended beneath the surrounding land in ways that could be accessed by people willing to do the necessary work. Her father's surveys told her the answer, and the answer was yes. The feature extended to the southwest and to the east, in a pattern he had mapped carefully and annotated in the journals describing it as a formation of unusual extent and unusual character. And he had noted in his careful way which areas of the surrounding land showed the surface indicators, the unfrozen ground in winter, the specific vegetation patterns, the subtle temperature differentials that a person would not notice unless they were looking for them and knew what to look for. She showed the families the surveys. She showed them the indicators. She explained the construction method from her father's notes, the stone-cutting techniques and the structural approach and the ventilation calculations. All of it laid out in his precise hand in the journals that she now treated as the technical manual they had always been intended to be. Abel worked with her. He became the engineering intelligence behind the construction, translating the geological truth into the practical vocabulary of building understanding from his decades of working with materials, how the stone needed to be cut and fitted, and how the chambers needed to be proportioned for the warmth to distribute properly. He worked with the efficiency and the competence of a man who has found the project that was waiting for him, who has discovered late in a good life that there was still something large and important left to build. The first of the 3 homes was completed before the following autumn. It was not as refined as what Walter Holt had built, the work of people learning a new kind of construction, rather than the work of a master who had spent 10 years perfecting it. But the warmth was real, and the stone was solid. And when the first cold of October settled over Greystone Pass, that year the family living in it felt the steady rising from the deep earth and understood what it meant to have a home that the weather could not reach. The second and third were completed the following year. Then came a 4th and a 5th, and the architecture that Walter Holt had invented alone on the scratch began to spread through the valley, the way useful things spread when they are genuinely useful, not through persuasion, but through evidence, not through advocacy, but through the simple fact of a warm family in a Wyoming winter, in a house that did not require them to spend half their income on firewood and spend half their energy on fear. Elara did not grow rich from the patent. That was not its purpose and not what it produced. It produced something less spectacular and more durable, which was a claim of priority and a protection against the particular kind of theft that had taken her father's life. The theft committed by men who understand that knowledge is property, and that property undefended is property invited to be taken. The patent said that this knowledge belonged to Walter Holt, and by his death to his daughter, and that anyone who wished to develop the method would need to acknowledge that fact, which most people in Greystone Pass, having seen what the acknowledgement looked like in practice, were glad to do. She lived a long life on the scratch, longer than she had expected in those first cold weeks when she stood on the rise above the useless land and tried to find something in it worth holding on to. She did not remarry, which was a choice she made with the full weight of everything that Emmett had been, and the understanding that what she had found in the underground chambers of her father's building was a sufficient life. a complete life. A life that did not require another person at its center to be whole. But she was not alone. She was seldom alone. People came to her with questions, and she answered them. They came with problems, and she helped them think through the problems the way her father had helped her think. Not by providing answers, but by asking the questions that led to answers, by pointing at the evidence and letting people understand it themselves. She became the person in Greystone Pass whom other people came to when they needed to think clearly, which was not a title or a position, but a function, the function of a person who has learned from a lifetime of careful observation that most problems yield to patient attention. She kept her father's journals on the stone shelf at the head of her sleeping space, where she had put them on the first day. She added to them over the years, keeping her own records in a hand that was less precise than his, but no less careful, recording temperatures and observations and the small technical discoveries that came from living the way she lived, and paying attention to the things that most people walked over. The journals accumulated. They became eventually a library of accumulated knowledge about this particular piece of earth, and what it was capable of and what it asked of the people who lived above it, and in it and with it. She thought about her father often. She thought about him in the easy way of someone who has made a complete peace with a loss, not the way she had thought about him in the first months after his death, which was the way you think about something that has been taken from you with grief and anger, and the specific pain of incompleteness. She thought about him the way you think about someone who has given you something large and permanent, with the kind of gratitude that is quiet, because it is settled, because it has had time to become part of the ordinary texture of your days rather than a sharp and exceptional feeling. He had given her the earth's own warmth. He had spent the last years of his life in the cold and the dark, building it for her. And he had gotten it done, and it had been enough. More than enough. It had been, in the end, everything. In the evenings, sometimes she would climb the 40 steps and sit at the top and look at the Wyoming sky, the stars coming out over the high country. With their usual extravagance, too many to count and cold and brilliant, and so far away that looking at them was an exercise in understanding the scale of things. She would sit there in the cold with the mineral breath of the deep earth rising past her from below, and feel the two temperatures on her skin, at once the ancient heat of the stone depths and the indifferent cold of the surface world. And she would think about how thin the line was between them, how close the steady underground warmth always was to the cold, how it was always there, always rising, always available to anyone patient enough and brave enough to go down and find it. The people of Greystone Pass told their children about her. They told the story the way communities tell the stories that matter to them, not as history exactly, but as instruction, as a lesson encoded in a narrative so that it would carry further and last longer than a simple statement of principle. They told their children about the young widow who had refused to sell, and who had trusted a dead man's letter, and who had swung a sledgehammer for 8 days in the October cold, because she believed that what was underground was worth reaching. They told them about the door and the 40 steps and the warmth at the bottom. They told them about the blizzard and the man who had crawled through the snow to find her. They told them about the woman who had opened the door to her enemy in the worst night of the storm, who had given shelter to the man who had tried to steal it from her, and what that act had meant about what kind of person she was, and what kind of understanding she had arrived at about the difference between justice and vengeance. They told these stories to teach their children what they had learned from watching Elara Holt live her life on the scratch, which was a thing about patience and a thing about attention and a thing about the kind of courage that does not announce itself, but simply keeps moving, keeps working, keeps its hands on the pry bar, and its eye on the hinge, and its faith in what lies beneath. The surface, her father had written, is a liar. The value he had written is not on the surface, and 40 steps down the earth kept its promises. It kept them the way the earth keeps everything, without sentiment and without drama and without requiring anyone to believe in them. The scent of deep stone and ancient time rose through the iron grate in the floor of a circular chamber beneath 5 acres of Wyoming rock that everyone had agreed was worthless. It rose past the sleeping spaces and the stone shelves and the careful journals and the iron chest with its brass lock. It rose up the long stairwell through the fitted stone past the brackets and the stovepipe and the rope guide worn smooth by hands going up and down in every season. It rose to the surface and met the cold world there at the edge of the opening, offering itself to anyone who came close enough to feel it. Patient as it had always been patient, steady as it had always been steady, keeping the promise of deep things to anyone willing to go low enough, and still enough, and humble enough to receive it, which is, in the end, the only way anyone has ever received anything that the earth truly has to give.